Hello guys and welcome back. Today we will paint the M1117 Guardian, add some mud and fix some rather annoying mistakes that came up along the way. Let's get right into it. We start by removing some parts to make the whole thing easier to handle. That's why I designed the anti-drone armor in a way to keep it removable. And then it's straight into the airbrush booth. This time I'm also testing out a product that's new to me, Galeri's Kaleido Acrylic Primer. A stress test. I didn't wash the model beforehand, nor did I prime the metal parts separately. Let's see how the primer performs. I sprayed the primer without any thinner, straight from the bottle. It worked surprisingly well too. The airbrush didn't clog and there was no sputtering or anything like that. As you can see, just 1 or 2 coats were enough for a full coverage. And here are the primed parts after drying. A super smooth surface and a very nice, slightly matte finish. So far, I can highly recommend these primers and will definitely continue using them. I'm now painting the entire vehicle with this color. I want a uniform base coat, so I am applying several thin layers, one after the other. For the camouflage I had 2 options. Desert sand, like shown on the box art, or the NATO 3-tone camo pattern. The choice was quite clear, as the vehicles used in Ukraine are all in the woodland camo. I already painted such a pattern on this channel a few years ago. At that time I added improvised winter camo on top. The paints I am using here are from Ammo's Atom range. I really like them as they spray nice and smooth. Since they are acrylics just like AK's 3rd gen ones, cleanup is quite fast as well. The paint here is thinned with the dedicated thinner, but I never use any set ratios. And here's the Guardian fully painted in green. Ammo's Atom colors really have a nice smooth finish. I'm going to use the remaining colors from the NATO set for the camouflage pattern as well. And I begin with the brown. That means it's also time to put my freehand airbrushing skills to the test again. I still find it quite difficult to spray a decent, clean pattern. Rough shapes work out fine, but things start to look messy as soon as I get into the details. Fortunately, the pattern here isn't too complicated, so everything should work out. I used the painting guide included in the box as a basis and more or less followed it. The brown might look quite light at first glance. However, you have to keep in mind that colors on a small scale generally need to be a bit lighter than on the actual vehicle. Also, the paint tends to darken slightly as it dries. I experienced the exact same confusion back when I used AK Interactive's NATO colors. And then we have the black. I tried carefully marking the relevant areas with a pencil here, since these patches are somewhat larger and extend across the entire vehicle. I usually worry about the pencil marks, that they might show through the paint later on, but with black that shouldn't be an issue. Interestingly, the black actually required more coats for a full coverage than the brown. I would have expected it to be the other way around. I tried removing the protective cap from the front of my airbrush here at the turret. Suddenly the spray was much finer and more precise. I will have to do some more testing to see if it was really just the cap or if my mixture was simply better this time. And here we have our finished camouflage pattern, serving as a base. To start introducing some variation, I'm going to try my hand at pre-shading once again. For this I will mix a slightly lighter shade of green first. I am now spraying this color over the previous green in a mottled pattern. The color difference is somewhat more subtle than I expected, so the effect won't be very noticeable later on. However, I didn't want the contrast to be too strong, as I did not want the vehicle to look faded. That said, this step also allows me to touch up some mistakes. With modern vehicles, the question of chipping often comes up. Is it realistic or not? I believe that a vehicle like this, which sees active service, would indeed exhibit a certain amount of chipping. To make things a bit easier for myself, I am using the sponge method here. I'm dabbing the sponge along the lower edges and corners. Since the Guardian is quite tall, we need to pay close attention to the height of the chips to keep the effect more realistic. Since this vehicle is used for reconnaissance, I can imagine that shrubs and low-hanging trees would leave some marks on the lower part of the vehicle. However, the upper section would likely remain largely unscathed, as the surfaces of modern vehicles are less prone to damage caused by the crew. For the color, I chose this dark rust tone. Ironically, the spots with the most chips turn out to be the ones with the mud too. So the step is probably optional after all, but for the sake of completeness, I'm doing it anyway. However, you can also use the chipping to highlight specific parts in general. On the actual vehicle, the cover over the ammunition belt is removable. That's why I imagine a part like that would be more prone to chipping than the immediate surrounding area. The vehicle itself still has the weld-on mounting points for the cages that I added. Since these were added later, I can't leave them in the camouflage color. A medium grey provides a good base for the subsequent effects. I will now paint the remaining details with a brush as well. The jerrycans in a sand yellow for a bit more contrast, along with the tarp and the backpack on the rear of the vehicle. For the colors here, it is always good to go with different sand, brown or olive shades for some additional variation. I have to admit, my storage and equipment painting skills are pretty basic still, as I have not spent as much time with those more organic shapes. But that just means I need to build more tanks with a ton of storage on top, I guess. For brush painting, it is recommended to thin the paint quite a lot. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of brush strokes and may even paint over some details. But thin paint means multiple layers. I left out most of the clear parts in the first construction stage. Now I am painting the backgrounds of the headlights and other lights in a metallic silver color. Of course, I mustn't forget the barrels for the machine gun and the grenade launcher. I am painting them in a dark grey. Ideally, nothing of the inside of the angled mirrors should be visible later on, but just to be on the safe side, I'm painting them black again. Various markings are used and seen on vehicles in Ukraine. Since I don't have any decals, however, I have to draw mine myself. To do this, I'm trying out a white chalk stick. I'm using it to paint simple crosses all over the sides. Hopefully, the chalk will create an effect of a messy, hand-painted marking. I then protect them with a coat of clear varnish. Next up is a basic, simple pin wash. I started by using a dark oil paint to accentuate all the details and textures. This allows me to effectively depict a fine layer of dirt and grime, especially on the anti-slip texture. Oddly enough, the shade became significantly lighter after drying, so I went back over it with a darker premixed wash. Next up is the weathering for the vertical surfaces. As usual, I use a light dust-colored wash to create vertical streaks and rain marks. First, I apply rough strokes with a brush, which I then blend using a flat brush. In the end, only very fine streaks should remain visible. And this effect can be repeated as you desire. What kind of weathering effects do you use on the vertical surfaces? I feel like the options are always quite limited. You can do some filters with oil colors or dedicated filter washes, a pin wash and streaking effects, but for most cases that is about it, I think. And for whatever reason, I still have to find the ideal way for doing those streaks here. Either they blend away completely, needing many layers, or the first layer is so stuck in place that I can barely blend it. And now we come to the more exciting part, and the one where the things can and will go wrong, the mud effects. We will start off quite simple with a layer of acrylic mud in the wheel arches. I picture the Guardian in a deep mud and rough terrain, so I am applying a generous layer here. While this product has a nice base color, its primarily purpose is to build up volume. I can blend the edges with a bit of water, even though I will use other products here later to blend it even further. I also apply very small amounts of this mud texture to the lower corners and edges. However, I can't make the layers too thick in these spots, as the wet mud would be likely to slide off. And now you can also clearly see that most of the previous chipping is already covered up and invisible. On a wheeled vehicle, mud behaves a bit differently, and we need to pay closer attention to the bottom of the vehicle. In a more arid or dry area, all you need here is some dust. Due to the higher clearance, there is less chance of the vehicle getting in direct contact with the ground. In my case, I want to show the Guardian after it drove through heavy, deep mud. So I need to add a few larger clumps of dirt even on these higher parts. I might as well remove the masks from the windows right now, before the tape damages the clear parts too much. And it looks like the masks worked really well for once. Now it is time again for the remaining clear parts. I paint the lenses and glass panels using red, orange and green respectively. And then I carefully attached them with glue to the areas previously painted silver. The silver behind the clear parts creates a very realistic effect, making them look like genuine headlights. Just make sure to use a glue that dries completely clear. Let's get back to the dirt effects, as the first layer has dried. Dirt would accumulate differently on the roof, much less of it, and drier than down on the vehicle's body. That's why real, fine garden soil works beautifully here. The individual grains and clumps naturally vary in size, creating more visual variety than pigments. I can use a brush to position the soil exactly where I want it, primarily in the corners. This could represent dirt dragged up by the crew or soil kicked up by larger explosions. A few short blades of grass can further improve the texture. These are all from a product called seagrass balls, a natural product found on some coasts that you can also buy if you are lucky and find some. With a pair of scissors I cut a few fibers off to get a nice variety in size. That is also why I prefer this natural product over regular static rares. Every piece looks different and it does not look as artificial, obviously. In addition, the color is a lot more realistic than on any of the other options. To glue everything in place, I use Ammo's Sand and Gravel Fixer. I pick up some of the thin adhesive with a brush and carefully dab it over the soil, ensuring everything is thoroughly saturated by the end. Now I'm turning my attention to the add-on armor. After priming everything black, I applied a coat of rust brown paint. For some reason, this color had incredibly poor coverage and adhesion. However, the black primer mitigated the issue as it resulted in greater color variation, so a win in the end. Next I apply a chipping effect here as well, though the approach is reversed in this case. I represent areas that aren't heavily rusted yet using a lighter shade of grey, which I dab onto the structures. I think this effect particularly looks good on the wire mesh. I prime the scraps of fabric I made from green stuff dark grey. I create the additional rust effects using various AK weathering pencils, watercolor pencils in shades that are ideal for scale modeling. By using a wet brush, I can pick up the pigment from the pencils and apply it directly to the metal parts, just like a thin wash. I'm a big fan of these pencils for rust effects because the color dries completely matte and is very easy to manipulate. The only downside is that being watercolor based, the pigment can easily be removed unintentionally. I am now using the same colors on the connecting parts on the vehicle itself. And that is one of the reasons why I prefer to prime such parts in grey rather than directly in a rust tone. I can easily control the intensity this way, automatically creating very subtle color variations on the metal frames. For the next step, I need the airbrush once again. I want to try a pre-dusting effect here too. For this, I am using a slightly browner shade that roughly matches the previous effects. I am spraying a fine layer of dust over the lower sections of the vehicle. The effect should be as subtle as possible, without any hard edges. And this is also the stage where the choice of color is becoming crucial, as it will influence the final tones. I am also doing some pre-dusting on the roof, partly to blend the colors and partly to hide unsightly glue residue. Unfortunately, I think I applied a bit too much glue here, which left visible harsh outlines. But the fine dusting takes care of all of that. And now we come to the rubber tires, the part that almost drove me to scrap the entire project right before the finish line. But first things first. After priming, I painted the rubber tires in a slightly lighter shade of grey. This gives the rubber a more aged look and suggests a light layer of dust, as opposed to the stark, jet black tires. And this is where the first mistake happened. To give the mud a bit more texture and volume, I mixed the enamel effect with some plaster powder, hoping to achieve a more grainy texture. I applied the mixture to the tires and pressed it deep into the tread, then wiped the tread clean with a cloth. That's when the problem started. At first, the mud looked exactly the way I wanted, but then the surface began to smooth out and lose all of its texture. I suspect that is a little quirk of the enamel product. I tried adding some texture myself back by stippling it with a brush, but it just looked really bad. So bad, in fact, that I promptly tossed the whole thing into a jar of turpentine to wash it all off. The tires were reasonably clean afterwards, but some of the paint had come off too, so I had to repaint everything all over again. So here we are back to the familiar basics with products that I know, the acrylic mats I always use. Now I'm applying it all over the edges and tread again, covering up the last remnants of the old stuff. I'm wiping off the excess once again. Even during application, the result is much closer to what I was aiming for. Trying out new techniques is great, but it's frustrating when things go so wrong. But don't worry, it gets even better. Now that the effect has dried, I'm very happy with how things look so far. Next up is another wash. I originally intended to use it to represent dried mud, but the colors didn't work at all. So we can basically ignore that step, since I went over it again later with better effects anyway. And now we come to the absolute disaster. I was aware that attaching the wheels later would be tricky without the effects chipping off, but I didn't expect it to be this bad. Large areas are chipped off completely, right down to the rubber. At least the tread patterns are reasonably intact, but that means starting all over again and repainting everything. That was also the point where I decided to cover the tires almost entirely in mud. Not just around the edges, but right up to the rim. The colors look very uneven right now since this is the raw product, but we will fix that in a moment. First, I want to build up enough texture again and address any spots showing the bare rubber. To give everything a uniform color, I'm using this rich dark brown. I'm spreading it all over the tires now to even out the different shades. Using white spirit makes it very easy to blend and further refine the transitions. This enamel color is one I for some reason just tried out recently, despite owning it for quite a while. And I wish I used it earlier, because it is probably one of my favorite shades by now, especially for darker matte. And it works really well with the dark acrylic matte too. Usually enamel effects are a bit harder to blend than for example oil colors, as their pigments behave a little differently. But here I had a great success in creating a soft, dust-like transition right around the wheel arc. When I blend them, I try to keep the brush clean and damp to carefully move the pigment and thin it a bit. And I think it turned out pretty good here. I should not forget the dirt on the roof either. Otherwise, I will end up with two completely different shades that would look completely unrealistic. The final mud effects consist of various mud splatters. For this I use two different enamel splatter effects from Ammo, one lighter shade and one darker shade. Such variation is important not only to depict different soil types, but also to represent both wet and dry mud. I use my airbrush to blow air onto a loaded brush, causing tiny droplets to scatter all across the vehicle. Should any drops turn out too large, they can easily be removed or blended using white spirit. That's still why I prefer this effect over water-based acrylic splatter effects. This effect is particularly important right next to the wheels. After all, A normal car can get very dirty just from driving on an ordinary grimy road. So just imagine how filthy a vehicle like this would get in rain and mud. Compared to vehicles from the Second World War, for example, modern vehicles are incredibly fast. In terrain where a Tiger tank would only advance slowly and kick up little dirt, a vehicle like this could end up completely caked in mud from top to bottom. I can also use this effect to coat the undercarriage. Naturally, the fabric straps on the add-on armor will also get dirty. For this I am using the same colors as before and blend them with White Spirit for a soft transition. Now I can attach all the extras to the vehicle once again. All I have to do is slot them back into the mounts that are already correctly positioned. I can also use the previous colors to add some slight dust effects to the frames themselves. Last but not least, I want to quickly make a few camouflage nets. To do this, I first mix some green paint, wood glue and water together in a cup. Then I spread out a piece of bandage and distribute the paint all over it. If that takes too long, and you don't mind a bit of a mess, you can simply dip the whole bandage directly into the cup and wring it out in the end. Once dry, we have a dyed camouflage net that I can cut to size as desired. And a little water makes it flexible again, allowing it to be shaped into realistic positions. And with that, we have wrapped up this episode. I'm honestly relieved, especially after the whole debacle with the wheels. Rubber tires are just a pain and cause more trouble than they are worth. Still, I think I managed to salvage the situation. Aside from that, I really enjoyed working on this project. It was a nice change of pace to build a modern vehicle, complete with plenty of scratch-built extras. Will there be a diorama for it? Maybe down the line, but right now I don't even have any suitable figures, so it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. And there are other projects on the agenda that I will address first. That said, if you have any ideas, still feel free to let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.